Welcome to this discussion on the dialectical relationship between colonial power and knowledge. The aim here is to understand the performative aspects of this knowledge production in general, and in the Arab and the Muslim world in particular. This will help us understand the present reality of the greater Middle East and beyond. Knowledge formation is the bedrock of Western imperialism and its ongoing coloniality. In a previous discussion, we explained the Orient-Occident structure of Western civilization, which has produced Orientalist knowledge to sustain this binary. This colonial knowledge-power dialectic has constructed the Orient in relation to the Occident or the West. So we are not talking about the Orient per se, or the Arab and Muslim societies as independent entities of their own history and their own reality. This relational formation or construction of the Orient from the standpoint of the West has generated two theoretical frameworks of Orientalism. The first, which is the dominant account, was introduced by Edward Said in his book Orientalism, which was published in 1978. Let's listen to this clip where he powerfully explains Orientalism.
If somebody, let's say in the 1850s or 60s in Paris or London, wished to talk about or read about India or Egypt or Syria, there would be very little chance for that person to simply address the subject, as we like to think, in a kind of free and creative way. A great deal of writing had gone before. And this writing was an organized form of writing, like an organized science, what I've called Orientalism. And it seemed to me that there was a kind of repertory of images that kept coming up, the sensual woman who's there to be sort of used by the man. The East is a kind of mysterious place full of secrets and monsters. The marvels of the East was a phrase that was used. And the more I looked, the more I saw that this was really quite consistent with itself. It had very little to do with people who had actually been there. And even if they had been there, there wasn't much modification. In other words, you didn't get what you could call realistic representations of the Orient, either in literature or in painting or in music or any of the arts. And this extended even further into descriptions of the Arabs by experts, people who had studied them. And I noticed that even in the 20th century, some of the same images that you found in the 19th century, amongst scholars like Edward William Lane, who wrote his book on the modern Egyptians in the early 1830s. And then you read somebody in the 1920s, and they're more or less saying the same thing. One great example that I always give is that the wonderful French poet Gérard de Nerval, who went on a voyage to the Orient, as he called it. And I was reading this book of his travels in Syria, and there was something very familiar about it. It sounded like something else that I'd read. And then I realized that what he was doing almost unconsciously was quoting Lane on the Egyptians, on the theory that the Orientals are all the same, no matter where you find them. I mean, if it's in India or in Syria or in Egypt, it's basically the same essence. So there develops a kind of image of the timeless Orient, as if the Orient, unlike the West, doesn't develop, it stays the same. And that's one of the problems with Orientalism, is it creates an image outside of history, of something that is placid and still and eternal, which is simply contradicted by the facts of history. You see, so in that one sense, it's a creation of you might say an ideal other for Europe.
As you probably observed, his account focuses on Western representations of the East or the Orient. Orientalist knowledge from this perspective colludes with Western imperial power to facilitate the domination and subjugation of the Arab and the Muslim society and exploit their wealth and their resources. Therefore, Orientalism is a Western discourse, which is essential for the formation of the Western identity itself. It is a product and it is produced by the West and for the West, for the Western own consumptions. It has little to do with the people of the Orient and their lived reality and experience. In other words, Orientalism is based on a relationship of othering. Yet, we immediately run into this problem. Othering involves an ethical relationship between two humans, or two selves at least. In other words, there is already a recognition of equality in this relationship. Yet colonial and Orientalist knowledge is not predicated on ethical relations, but on sovereign power to dominate, which already declares colonial agents as subjects and the colonized as objects. So in Orientalism, the other is not a self or a human, but an object of a colonial self. And there is no ethical relationship between a self and an object, between humans and other objects that are out there in the nature. Additionally, the representational and discursive account of Orientalism is itself a product of a liberal and Enlightenment structure of thought. And this structure is the very basis of European modern coloniality. Hence, this account of Orientalism, which Edward Said presents in his book, is still bound by the epistemology of European modernity, and I will follow Walter Manolo and say modernity/coloniality, because there's no modernity without coloniality, without elimination, conquest, and subjugation of non-Europeans, other species, as well as nature. In other words, the structure, which is the modern colonial epistemology, which is part of the colonial matrix of power, as we said in a previous discussion, is still intact and not critically dealt with in the Saidian Orientalism. His theory focuses on the symptoms and manifestations of Orientalism and on how Arabs and Islamic societies are represented in the West, in the Western media and the Western movies and so on. Said's work is very instructive and inspiring, and even though it didn't touch the heart of Orientalism, it gave many scholars directions and insights to keep interrogating this imperialist knowledge. And this is where we will be turning now, to discuss the second account of Orientalism as presented by Wael Hallaq, who is also a professor of humanities at Columbia University, the same university where Edward Said used to teach. Wael Hallaq provides a deeper understanding and deeper theory of Orientalism in his book, which was published in 2018, Restating Orientalism, a period 40 years since Said's book was published. Rather than focusing on representational aspects, we need to look at the brain that animates Orientalist knowledge in order to see its constitutive, performative, and structural dimensions. Orientalism and Orientalist knowledge have practical outcomes on the ground. They don't just represent and describe. This Orientalist knowledge does things and transforms its subjects. And there is a big difference between a mere representation of someone or a society and transforming their subjectivity. In this context, Orientalism is epistemic and integral to Western modernity and coloniality, which are predicated on the idea of transforming its objects, that is, the colonized societies, nature, and anything touched by modernity. And this transformation is essentially eliminatory. It works by transforming and eliminating aspects of the colonized subjectivity, by downgrading, even destroying their cultures, traditions, ways of being and knowing, their languages, and so on, and replacing them with Western modern colonial alternatives. Now the question is this: what's the epistemic foundation of Orientalism? Why do we have Orientalism in the first place? Why non-European civilizations and cultures in China, India, Islam, which were very powerful and conquered other spaces and other places in the world, did not develop something similar to Orientalism. Orientalism is only one type of a larger field of colonial knowledge, which aims to produce both colonial subjects and colonized objects. The subject-object distinction of part of the colonial matrix of power and the coloniality it creates. This framework of power is deeply colonial. Orientalism is the type of knowledge production that has been directed at Islam and Islamic societies. It was initially used to transform societies living under the Ottoman Caliphate, British India, and Dutch Indonesia. Orientalism has two immediate targets. The first is the sovereignty, transforming the conception of sovereignty in these societies, and the second is transforming their economic structures. Let's now dig deeper into the meaning of these concepts and these structures in the Islamic tradition so we can begin to understand how Orientalism operates. The concept of sovereignty or dominion is key to grasp Islamic epistemology. The human, or al-insan, is not a sovereign subject in the Islamic thought and cosmology. I should draw your attention here that even the concept of a human is a Euro-modern colonial one, but we will be using it in a limited way. In Islam, the human has no real ownership or dominion or sovereignty over earth, nature, other species, or anything else. Humans are part of and live in the world or the universe and not above it. And this is a non-anthropocentric understanding of the human-earth or nature relationship. Rather than sovereignty, humans have a limited and temporary custodianship of the earth. And notice here, I didn't say over the earth. And this is a permanent principle. The second target of Orientalism is the organization of the economy. If humans don't have real sovereignty and ownership over earth, which is the source of all wealth, then their economy must also reflect this foundational principle. The economy in Islam belongs to the realm of ethics, not to the so-called free market or free capitalist market. This is why the waqf system, the endowment and charity, which is the backbone of the Islamic economic organization, was immediately attacked by the colonial powers. The Islamic economic system, with the waqf as its backbone, generated specific checks and balances in the Islamic tradition, whereby the executive and judicial powers were already separated and limited by the Sharia for centuries before the appearance of the liberal democracy. Also, the executive power of the state, ad-dawla, did not control the economy or the waqf system. And this economy was used, the waqf in particular, was used to finance knowledge production that keeps the rulers and the sultans in check by the scholars or the ulama. Unlike the European modern nation-state system, knowledge and power production in the Islamic civilization were driven by ethics and were separated from the power and authority of the state and the executive authority of the rulers. The main purpose of this knowledge is to produce a moral subject and by extension a moral society. To use Foucault's term or concept, this technology of the self operates internally and is above the will of power, above authority, sovereignty, and the sultans. Now let's quickly get into the European modern understanding of sovereignty, power, state, and the kind of subjectivities it creates. European modernity began as a settler colonial project in 1492. It is based on a Cartesian rationality of a subject versus an object, where the subject or man or the human is believed to be sealed in itself and functions as the source of reason, morality, and sovereignty. The modern subject defines its relationship to everything. And this relationship has taken the form of dominion or sovereignty over earth and much else. The idea of dominion was initially derived from the Bible and later on was secularized. As a sovereign subject, this Euro-modern man decides the rules of the game as well as the exceptions to these rules. So these rules are not fixed. Then it is not surprising to find that since the 16th century, European philosophy and philosophers such as Victoria, Grotius, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, and many others begin their theories and philosophy with the idea of sovereignty over the hypothetical state of nature. The mission these thinkers took upon themselves is to provide arguments and rationality as well as recipes on how to transform and align societies and make them fit for sovereign rule and governance, which as we know took the form of nation states. And this modern knowledge and philosophy is built on two main distinctions. The first is the distinction between the human and nature, the subject-object division, and the second is another distinction within the category of the human itself, which had theological basis. The full human was regarded as Latin European Christian, and later on it was biologized with the advance of the secular and modern science. And here where race and racism begin to play a structural role in modernity and modern formation of the state and the society. Racial distinctions, which gave meaning to the Orient-Occident binary, which began and were introduced during the first European settler colonial invasion of Palestine and Syria in the 11th century, namely the Crusaders, this knowledge excludes non-Europeans from the category of the human, or from the category of the full and mature and rational human. In this way, non-Europeans became objects to be transformed, modified, developed, civilized, and so on. It follows then that the full human, the mature human, the European white Latin Christian, has the right to rule over these non-humans or these underdeveloped human beings. Liberal and Enlightenment philosophers and thinkers played a significant role in maintaining and creating this division between the European and non-European human. They provided a rich arsenal of concepts that designate the latter, the non-Europeans, as subhumans, as barbarians, beasts, if you want, uncivilized, unmature, children, tribal, who need the authority of the rational, the full human, the authority of the Europeans to guide them and develop them. And this colonial discourse continues today and informs the relationship between the West and the global South. Consider the following example to understand how powerful this colonial discourse in today's politics. In 2002, the chief of the European Foreign Policy, Joseph Borrell, advised European students of diplomacy to look at the world as a divide between a garden and a jungle. Now, how does modern knowledge produces coloniality? First, you need a colonial subject to carry out colonialism. That's why, to quote Wa'il Hallaq, colonialism did not begin in the distant colonies, but right at home. It began with a kind of teaching and advice that was given by this kind of the European chief of foreign policy to the students to look at the world as a jungle. The Euro-modern subject and society are made by the modern state, by the kind of education, by the kind of authority provided by this system of power and sovereignty. The colonial agents are subjects to the will of power. And here, Foucault's analysis of biopolitics, of school systems, prisons, hospitals, give brilliant examples of how the production of subjectivity works within the Western modern state system. He also shows us how the state took from the church the idea of pastoral care for purposes of governmentality to govern from distance through a specific kind of subjectivity that has a particular modern rationality and epistemological formation, which enables these subjects to do what they ought to without direct interventions from the authorities. Modernity and its sovereign power colonized the European subjects so that they, as epistemological colonialist agents, see the world in Orientalist ways before being deployed outside Europe to invade faraway lands and nations. And this brings us closer to the core of the problem, which is the fact that transformation and elimination are inbuilt within modern colonial sovereignty. This sovereignty, this conception of sovereignty and domination and authority, and the transformation of nature and non-Europeans became signs of progress, of development and enlightenment. The progress narrative that we are dealing with here is a linear one and is predicated on Western terms and conditions and has been used to entrench domination. But if you are not the source of the progress narrative, then you will neither have a past nor a future. Also, your present reality is destabilized. Your past or metaphysics become objects as things to be transformed, reformed, and even destroyed and replaced with European norms and values. Europe, or becoming Europe-like, becomes the future of the colonized. The colonized will not progress towards her or himself, but towards something and someone else. This chase is never ending because the colonized is already a racialized object of the Euro-modern sovereignty and coloniality. And people in the global south are always being asked to pursue progress and bombarded with the discourse and schemes of development, reformation, adjustment. So the progress narrative produces fragile and confused subjects and societies so that coloniality of power keeps working inside these societies from distance and from within. The Arab and the Islamic world, as well as the global south more broadly, has been subject to Euro-colonial programs ranging from civilizational missions, modernization, democratization, judicial reforms, all the way down to European geopolitical schemes such as the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership or the European Neighborhood Policy. And here the major difference is the fact that the Orient, or Islam in particular, the Islamic societies, did not entertain the idea of a modern state or the concept of political sovereignty, because both sovereignty and politics were driven by the Islamic Sharia and the morality of that system, which stood stronger than politics, stronger than political manipulation, and above all institutions and rules and rulers. Orientalism is a colonial tool used to transform the Arab and Muslim societies. It has been doing things to them, not just producing discursive representations or misrepresentations about them. Here it is useful to underscore two major transformations, two profound changes that has been introduced as a result of Orientalism and Orientalist knowledge. The first is displacing the Islamic institution and conception of sovereignty, or rather non-sovereignty, and replacing it with a Euro-modern colonial one. Modern sovereignty, or the state system, was imposed and implanted in the Muslim world, and this was a gradual process of transformation that began with demands of reformations since the 19th century. Reformation began before the actual colonization of the Ottoman territories and continued after the colonization of Algeria by France, the British in India, and the Dutch in Indonesia. Reforms targeted the basic structures of the societies, including fields such as the judiciary, education, administration, governance, economics, ownership, and the military. And these reform schemes are still the same instruments that Western powers and institutions such as the EU, IMF, World Bank, etc., they still use to inform and impose their will on the global south. The second attack targeted the Islamic economic system, the Waqf system in particular. The attack on the Waqf, first by the French in Algeria and then copied elsewhere, this deeply ethical institution, which in the 19th century managed about 40–60% of the real property in the Muslim world, was used to finance public services, education, knowledge production, healthcare, and much more. But more importantly, it was a source of funding for the scholarly authority over the executive state and rulers. The Waqf was a system for redistribution of wealth and to finance social welfare. At the end, this system and this institution of Waqf and charity was placed under the direct authority of the state. So the scholars or ulama lost their independence and they were brought under the authority of the ruler or the state, and they could no longer do their role to keep the rulers in check. As a result, an entire political, social, ethical, epistemological order was distorted and demolished and replaced with a modern colonial institutional infrastructure that produced a state and a nationalist subject. These colonial structures were coached into the idea of civilizing the non-Europeans, and hence the idea of the civilizational missions. The idea of creating the citizen, which is governed and ruled by the system of citizenship, which is a legal relationship between the governed and the governor, between the ruled and the ruler. So the sovereign not only decides the nature and the scope of this relationship, the nature of the citizenship, but also decides and produces the very subjectivity and sensibilities of the citizen from birth to death. There is no citizenship in Islam, and this is for a reason, because citizenship is a legal relationship between the sovereign power or the authority or the ruler and the ruled. Islam doesn't have that conception of sovereignty as discussed earlier. All relations in Islam belong and derived from Sharia, not from the sultans or their authority. The subject in the Islamic tradition was not produced by the state or the authorities, but by the independent authority of the Islamic knowledge, which wasn't produced for power, but was focused on the production of an ethical subject and ethical societies. So colonial interventions changed that Islamic order. And since the 19th century, these interventions enforced a profound structural reformations that displaced an entire Islamic epistemological way of seeing and being in the world and replaced it with a European colonial epistemology. This is what Orientalism did to the Arab and Islamic societies. It reproduced them by creating a rupture between people and their ethics, epistemology, and institutions, so they could not anymore reproduce themselves in the same way they did for centuries. And in this way, coloniality carries on and continues even after decolonization and national independence.